Welcome to session 12, our final session of the Old Testament survey. Very soon we will be moving into the New Testament, but this is the final session of the Old Testament survey and is actually a bridge between the Old Testament survey and the New Testament survey as we talk about that period of time between the testaments. Or sometimes as it is called, the intertestamental period of time. Um, my name is Stephen Clybourne, and I am the senior pastor of Earl Street Baptist Church in Greenville, South Carolina. If you would like to follow along, the outline can be found on our study guide on pages 29 and 30, and you can find the study guide on our website at esbcgreenville.org. You simply click on the resources tab and then the Bible survey tab, and you can find not only the study guide, but also all of the videos in this series. Again, I encourage you to get in touch with me. I would love to hear from you if you have some feedback or some questions or just want to talk about any of this material. I encourage you to be in touch with me. I miss getting to interact with you in person in a classroom kind of setting. So I'm hoping that I'll hear from you, or at least let me know that you've gotten this far. I would love to hear from you. As I said, we're going to be talking today about the period of time known as the intertestamental period, or the period of time between the testaments. And because we're talking about the period of time between the testaments, there is no biblical material associated with this. Whatever we know about the period of time between the Old and New Testaments, we know from primarily the historical books of the material of the group of literature known as the Apocrypha. We're going to be talking today about the period of time between 440 and 63 BC. As you may recall from our Old Testament survey, the Old Testament period of time actually ended with the work of Ezra and Nehemiah. Um, Sometime around 440 BC. So from the time of Ezra and Nehemiah until the time of the New Testament, which would have begun with the birth of Jesus around 6 BC, the Bible gives no historical information. Almost everything we know from sources outside of the Bible. Well, first of all, when the Old Testament period ended, the people of the Hebrew people, or the Jews as they were known by then, were subject to the Persian Empire. And this Persian Empire lasted from 539 to 333 BC, a period of roughly 200 years. The Persian Empire had come to power around 550 and continued to control Palestine during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So conditions during conditions for the Jews during the Persian period were that the Jews from the time of the Babylonian exile, from that time on, the Jewish people were divided, and this scattering of the Jews is often referred to as the diaspora, Diaspora. The Palestinian Jews were more conservative, the Jews who stayed there in their homeland or returned to their homeland. They had a very closed tradition which centered on the Torah, the law of God, first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures. And they followed the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah and remained distinctive and separate. So those were the more conservative Jews. The Babylonian Jews, that is, the Jews who ended up staying in Babylon, predictably, became more liberal and open to their culture because they were more influenced. The longer they lived there, the more they kind of blended into their culture. And yet they were still, even within the Babylonian culture, they were still somewhat of a clique um, of their own. Well, during this period of time, the high priesthood was elevated to a status that was beyond mere religious duties. Of course, there's no king now because they are under the control of the Persians, but the high priest became, in addition to whatever official religious duties he had, became a kind of governor of the Jews in Jerusalem. During this time, the Palestinian Jews were granted considerable freedom, yet they were still subservient to the Persian authorities. There was a change in everyday language during this time, from Hebrew to Aramaic, though the religious language remained Hebrew. With the influence of the Jews that had been in Babylonian captivity, where the Aramaic language was spoken, Aramaic became a more prevalent speaking language. Also, during this time, synagogue worship continued to develop. Even though the temple had been rebuilt, synagogues were already established, local gatherings of Jewish men. The focus on the Torah gave rise to the oral traditions and the interpretations of the Torah, not only what the law said, but also what the traditions around that law taught. There developed an interest in wisdom teachings and literature. As we mentioned last time, it was during this period of time that the wisdom literature really flourished. Around 350 BC, the Persian Empire began to weaken as Philip of Macedon began to unite many of the Persian city-states in the area of Greece and Macedonia. During the reign of Darius III, 336 to 331, Philip of Macedon was assassinated. But the Greek Empire continued to emerge under the leadership of Philip's son, a young military genius named Alexander the Great. And with the coming of Alexander the Great, there was a new period of time that was ushered in, as Palestine then shifted from being under the control of the Persians to being under control of the Greeks. Alexander the Great, who reigned really a relatively short period of time, 333, 323 BC, united the Greek Empire around the Greek language and the Greek culture. His policies and influence, even though he himself did not reign but about 10 years, his policies and his influence, especially the influence of the Greek language and the Greek culture, would be felt for years to come and even throughout the New Testament period. He made Greek the universal language and required that it be taught in school. He pushed Greek philosophy, since he himself had studied under Aristotle, and he pushed Greek culture and Greek art and Greek customs and Greek literature. And he united the Greek Empire around the Greek language and the Greek culture. Well, upon the death of Alexander the Great in 323, the empire was divided among 4 of his generals, only 2 of whom affect the people of the Old Testament. So we're only going to focus on these 2. One whose name was Ptolemy, who was given control of Palestine and Egypt, and Seleucus, who was given control of Syria. And of course, Palestine was caught in the middle of this power struggle between these 2 power-hungry, paranoid generals, each of whom wanted Palestine as a buffer to be used against the other. So first, let's talk about the Ptolemies, those who were controlled by Ptolemy. The Ptolemies gained control over Palestine and continued to allow the Jews considerable freedom, still allowing local authority to the Jewish high priest. Seleucus and the followers of Seleucus, or those controlled by Seleucus, became known as the Seleucids, were based in Syria. By the year 200, the Seleucids overturned the Ptolemies as the power over Palestine, and under the leadership of a pivotal figure in their history, Antiochus Epiphanes, which literally means a revelation of a god. Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who was a Seleucid, began to oppress the Jews and push the Jews for the adoption of Greek culture and Greek religion. Remember, as long as the Ptolemies were in control, the Ptolemies allowed the Jews still a certain measure of autonomy, still under their control, but religious autonomy. Well, Antiochus Epiphanes interfered in the selection of the high priest, and in effect, he sold the position of high priest to the highest bidder. And so for the very first time in history, the high priesthood had completely degenerated into a political rather than a religious office. Antiochus Epiphanes also forbade Jewish religious activities, including circumcision. He set up an altar to the Greek god Zeus in the temple. Can you imagine the blasphemy of that to the Jews? And he ordered all the Jews to make sacrifice to Zeus. And he did the ultimate blasphemy, and that is he sacrificed a pig, considered to be an unclean animal, on the sacred altar in the Holy of Holies. Well, this act is what pushed the Jewish people over the edge, and it became known as the abomination of desolation. By this time, the Palestinian Jews sorry, I should have been revealing all these things as we went along. Well, by this time, the Jews were divided among themselves. There were the conservative Jews who opposed the Seleucids and the Greek culture being forced on them, and many of them came to be called the Hasidim, meaning the pious ones or the holy ones. And then there were the more liberal Jews who either favored or at least did not resist or oppose the Seleucids and the adoption of the Greek culture and religion. And these came to be known as the Hellenists. So you had two groups of Jews. When Antiochus Epiphanes came in and sacrificed a pig in the Holy of Holies of the temple, the conservative Jews, the Hasidim, radically resisted and opposed that. The more liberal Jews were saying, well, it's a new day and this is just the way it is now. Well, the conservative Jews revolted, and this came to be known as the Maccabean Revolt. It took place between 168 and 164 BC. The conservative Jews, who comprised the majority, revolted under the leadership of a man named Mattathias. And Mattathias had 5 sons, the most famous of whom was Judas Maccabeus. And when they revolted, their method, they didn't have any kind of organized militia or military. Their method was just guerrilla warfare. They had untrained armies and unsophisticated weaponry, but miraculously, their revolt was successful. And after about 3 years of civil war, the Seleucids in Jerusalem were amazingly defeated. It was an incredible victory. And so in December of 164 BC, the temple was reclaimed. It was ritually cleansed, and it was rededicated to the Lord on the anniversary of the abomination of desolation. And this rededication of the temple came to be the basis for Hanukkah, which is why Hanukkah is celebrated in the month of December. For the first and last time in many centuries, the Jews had gained their independence, and even though it was short-lived, Judas Maccabeus and his descendants founded a dynasty known as the Hasmonean dynasty that would rule Palestine from that time, 164 to 63 BC. So for a period of about 100 years, they had some independence, some measure of independence and autonomy. This period of time, it was shaky stability, and it was led by the descendants of the Maccabees. And you can read about this in the apocryphal book of First Maccabees, which is where we get a lot of the historical information. It was a time of shaky stability, during which time two distinctive parties began to emerge. A party known as the Pharisees, does that ring a bell? A religious party who kind of came out of the Hasidim. The Hasidim were the prototype of the Pharisees. And then there were the Sadducees. The Pharisees were a religious party concerned primarily about holiness. The Sadducees were more a political party, and their prototype was the more liberal group, the Hellenists, who were influenced by the Greek language and Greek culture. Well, there was a bloody civil war that erupted between those two parties in 67 BC that lasted until 63 BC, when a third group invited Rome to bring peace and stability to the land, to kind of put an end to the civil war and stabilize the territory. Well, in 63 BC, General Pompey of Rome invaded Palestine and ended the Jews' short-lived independence. So the Jews who were under the influence of the Persians and then the Greeks gained their independence, and then found themselves under the control and domination of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, as you know, would control Palestine from 63 BC all the way through the rest of the New Testament period and beyond. So from this point on, the Roman Empire is the dominant power that influences from a political standpoint and military standpoint, who influences the people of Palestine. So during this period of time, when the Romans were in control of Palestine, Judaism kind of settled into its own identity, a new kind of identity. In one way, all Jews were unified in certain beliefs and certain practices. All Jews everywhere believed in monotheism, which is the belief in only one God, based on the Shema in Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. There is only one God. You shall have no other gods before me. There's only one God, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God of their history. This belief by itself would have made the Jews pretty radical in their culture, because it was a polytheistic world. Almost everyone believed in multiple gods. But the Jews insisted that Yahweh was the God of all the nations. So all Jews everywhere, conservative and liberal, were unified in their belief in one God. They were also unified in what is called nomism, which comes from the Greek word nomos, which means law. They all believed in the law of God and believed that the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, first 5 books of our Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the Torah was God's gift to Israel and was the revelation of God's plan and purpose for Israel. Therefore, it was to be enforced, it was to be obeyed, it was to be a joy, not a burden. And different groups differed in their interpretations, but all Jews, different groups differed in their interpretations of how to apply the law, but all Jews believed in its centrality and its authority. A third reality that united all Jews everywhere, a third belief, was the belief in nationalism. They believed that the nation Israel was chosen by God to be God's priests. God did something unique with Israel that God did not do with other people, and they believed that God called them into being to be a nation. But there were also certain practices that united them. For example, temple worship. Every devout Jew vowed to journey to the Jerusalem temple to worship at least once in his or her lifetime, no matter how far he or she lived from Jerusalem. Temple worship was still believed to be central, and the temple was believed to be the unique place of God's presence, God's own house. Also, all Jews were united in their practice of circumcision, which was an act of identification with the Jewish community. All Jews were united in the practice of prayer. All Jews were united in their observance of the Sabbath day. Some observed it more strictly than others, but all observed it. And finally, all Jews were united in their practice of dietary laws. Certain foods were considered ritually unclean and were not eaten. So what you see there is the beliefs and practices that united all Jews during this intertestamental period of time, the period of time between the Old and New Testaments, 440 BC roughly to 63 BC, and even into the New Testament period. But within that unity, there was great diversity among the Jews. As I mentioned, there was a group known as the Pharisees. The Pharisees figure prominently in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This was a loosely knit group unified by their view of righteousness. And by righteousness, they meant ritual cleanness, freedom from spiritual contamination. Their name, Pharisees, actually came from the Hebrew word perishim, meaning separated, holy, righteous ones. The sect of the Pharisees probably developed out of the Hasidim that I just mentioned a little while ago, who had supported the Maccabean revolt in its beginnings. In proportion to the total population, most New Testament scholars believe that the Pharisees were relatively few in number. They were middle class laymen and they were common people. They were exclusivistic, that is, righteousness was required to be a part of their group. They were preoccupied with who was clean, who is unclean, who is in and who is out. So they were very exclusive in their practice of their faith. They were rigorously obedient to the Torah, and not just the Torah, but the oral traditions around the Torah, which they said put a hedge around the written law. So they believed, the Pharisees believed, that the Torah was not just the written scripture that we refer to as Genesis through Deuteronomy, but also the centuries of traditions and interpretations about the Torah. And the traditions became as authoritative as the Torah itself, as we will see when we get to the New Testament and Jesus encountered the Pharisees. They had what we would call an open canon, um, which, as I said, consisted not just of the letter of the law itself, um, not just the Torah, um, and not just the Nebi'im, which was the prophets, that body of literature known as the prophets, and not just the Ketubim, which is the body of literature known as the writings, but also all the oral traditions about what all of that meant. And so they had a kind of an open notion, an evolving, living, breathing notion of what it all meant. It was the Pharisees were a religious sect, not a political sect. The only time they were concerned with social and political issues were when these issues affected their religious practices. They were completely out of the political process, and they were never in trouble with Rome for that reason. They believed in the resurrection of the body. They believed in angels. They believed in eschatology, that there would come a time when God would bring the world to a resolution and an end. And they expected a kingly Messiah in the order of David, who would, through military strength and political prowess, establish a paradise on earth. All the prophecies about the kingdom and the kingly Messiah in the Old Testament prophets were interpreted to be a political kingdom, and they centered their attention in the synagogue, not in the temple. The Sadducees were made up of the priestly descendants, but they were, so in that sense, they were religious, but they were also, by this time, wealthy aristocrats. They had a more relaxed adherence to the Torah, and they had a very closed canon, which means that they had a very limited understanding of what Scripture was. And to them, Scripture was just the Torah, not the law, the prophets, the writings, and the traditions, but their idea of Scripture was just the law, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And they were much more politically oriented. Their primary purpose was just to kind of maintain the status quo. At times, they were the major political force so far as Rome was concerned, but they were far removed from the people. They were in constant conflict with the Pharisees. In fact, it was their civil war with the Pharisees from 67 to 63 BC that I mentioned earlier that precipitated Rome's intervention in 63 BC. Their beliefs were that there is no resurrection of the body, because remember, their scripture is only Genesis through Deuteronomy, so there's no reference to resurrection of the body in that passage. In the Torah. They had no view of angels, no view of eschatology, and they expected a priestly Messiah, of course, since they are priests themselves, not a kingly Messiah. They expected the Messiah to be not a new David, but a new Aaron, the priest. And because they were the priestly group, they centered their attention in the temple. Well, then there was another group called the Essenes, who were similar to the Pharisees, only more radical, if you can imagine. They also probably developed out of the Hasidim, and they represent more of a mindset, just kind of a way of thinking, than they did an official party. In many ways, they were similar to the Pharisees, only more radical. They were extremely exclusivistic, so exclusivistic, in fact, that they withdrew into the wilderness in a community near the Dead Sea called Qumran. And it was this community that preserved the scrolls, the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in 1947 and contained fragments from every Old Testament book except Esther. You remember I said last time that Esther was not included in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they also included other religious writings and commentaries and community works. So the Dead Sea Scrolls were the scrolls of the Essenes, which was a more radical group that withdrew into the wilderness near the Dead Sea. They were absolutely obsessed with purity. They were extremely rigorous in their obedience to the Torah and the oral traditions, very legalistic. And they had an open canon. Like the Pharisees, they accepted the Torah, the Nebi'im, the Kethabim, that is the law, the prophets, and the writings. And they apparently accepted the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha as well, which are pseudepigrapha means false writings, and the Apocrypha are those pieces of literature that were developed in the intertestamental period. They believed that God was continually revealing something new, and they saw themselves at the end of the age, and so they were constantly open to new revelation. They believed not in the resurrection of the body, but they believed in the immortality of the soul. And they also, like the Pharisees, believed in angels, and they believed in eschatology. And because they had given up on the present age, they put all of their stock and hope in the future. Only the world to come was important. This world they had kind of given up on. And then they spiritualized the notion of the temple, that God, they believed that God lived not in the actual building known as the temple in Jerusalem, but that God lived in them. Then there were the Zealots. The Zealots were the political revolutionaries whose objective was to free Israel from oppression. They were the ones who planned the revolts against the Romans to try to free the Israelites, just like the Maccabees had freed them from Greek control. There was a group known as the Therapeutae, who were conservative Jews who lived in Alexandria, Egypt, and they lived a very philosophical kind of lifestyle. Then there were the scribes, who figure prominently in the New Testament, in the Gospels particularly. The scribes were the lawyers of the Pharisees, and they were the kind of the official interpreters of the Torah, and they were the ones who actually developed the oral traditions about the Torah. They were the ones who made legal rulings on what it meant to what was involved in keeping the law. So if the law says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, the scribes would be the ones who would develop the traditions about what that means. What does it mean to keep the Sabbath day holy? What are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do? And then there were Baptist sects, not Baptist as we think of the term in modern times, but groups of people who literally baptized people. Conservative Jews who practiced immersion. The word baptism means to immerse or to dip, as an act of initiation into the Jewish community. And then finally, there was this general group known as the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. All of these other groups, the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, Therapeutae, Scribes, and Baptist sects, comprised only about 10% of the population in and around Palestine. The other 90% were just the common people, the people of the land. They were common, uneducated, poor, but honorable, decent citizens of society, and their only objective was really just to kind of keep their heads low and survive. Though they were good citizens, they were kind of the nobodies of society. Well, let's take just a moment to talk about the literature, the major types of literature of the intertestamental period. First of all, I keep referring to the Hebrew canon. The Hebrew canon consisted of three categories, as I have mentioned already. There was the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, that seemed to have been accepted and recognized as authoritative, holy, official scripture by the time of Ezra, somewhere around 440 BC. You remember Ezra called the people back to the law, and it seemed to have been established by that time that he was that the that those 5 books were considered authoritative scripture. Well, the second group of Hebrew scripture is known as the Nebi'im, which is the Hebrew word that means prophets. And the prophets seem to have been generally accepted and recognized as authoritative scripture somewhere around 200 BC. And the prophets were divided into 2 categories, the former prophets and the latter prophets. The former prophets were Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. And they're called the former prophets because the prophets who are referred to in those books, prophets like Elijah and Elisha and Nathan, and those were referred to in these sections, but were not writing prophets. The latter prophets were the writing prophets, and they were Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the book of the 12, as they were called. We call them the minor prophets just because they're relatively shorter. But Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then combined into one book were the 12 minor prophets. And that body of literature seems to have been accepted as scripture around 200 BC. The third group of Hebrew scripture that was finally recognized as scripture, the last, were the group of scripture known as the Ketuvim, which were the writings. The writings were officially accepted as Holy Scripture at the Council of Yamnia in 90 AD, when the Hebrew canon was officially closed. So you can see that during the New Testament period, the only 2 sections of Scripture that had been formally and officially accepted as scripture were the law and the prophets. So when Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, "Do not think that I have come to destroy the law and the prophets. I have not come to destroy them, but to fulfill them," that was his way of referring to these sections of scripture. And the reason he didn't say, "Do not think I have come to destroy the law, the prophets, and the writings," is because the writings had not been accepted as scripture at that time. So that's the Hebrew canon of scripture, what we would call the Old Testament, but what the Jewish people call the Hebrew canon. And sometimes they refer to it as the Tanakh, taking the T from Torah, the N from Nebi'im, and the K from Ketuvim, and putting vowels in it, Tanakh. Then there was the Alexandrian canon. The Alexandrian canon was the Greek translation of the Hebrew canon and the Apocrypha. And the Apocrypha were those books accepted by the Jews of Alexandria as part of their sacred writings that were not accepted as part of the Hebrew canon. So there were Jews in Alexandria, remember I said, who were more liberal and more open. They accepted the books of the Apocrypha as also part of their scripture. And so the Alexandrian canon was their translation of the Hebrew canon and the Apocrypha into the Greek language. And of course, those books include the historical book of First Maccabees that I have already mentioned, the quasi-historical fiction with a teaching purpose, books like Tobit and Judith, wisdom literature like the book of Ecclesiasticus, and apocalyptic literature like the book of Second Esdras. Then there was a group of literature known as the pseudepigrapha. Now that's a word you want to be sure to use tomorrow in conversation with somebody. Literally, that means writings with false superscriptions. It's like false writings. Basically, the pseudepigrapha was what we would call maybe popular religious journalism. And they were legends about biblical characters like the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs or the martyrdom of Isaiah, which tells about how Isaiah was sawn in half, or the Paralipomena of Jeremiah, or the Testament of Abraham, or the lives of the prophets, or the Testament of Job, or the life of Adam and Eve. This is popular religious journalism written between 200 BC and 200 AD that kind of lifted out certain prominent figures from the Old Testament and told some more fanciful stories about them. The pseudepigrapha also included some Psalms, like the Psalms of Solomon, and some apocalyptic works like First Enoch and the Assumption of Moses, Second Baruch, and the Apocalypse of Abraham. These are all books that were not considered scripture, but were considered popular religious journalism. We would say like a book by Billy Graham or something. We don't consider that scripture, but we pay attention to it. Then there were rabbinic works like the Targums that were Aramaic translations of the Old Testament. There were exegetical materials referred to as the Halakha, which were regulative materials, and the Haggadah, which were illustrative materials. There was the Mishnah, which was a topical compilation of halakhic and Haggadic materials. There was the Midrash, which was commentaries on the Old Testament books. There was the Tosefta, which were additions to the Mishnah. There was Baraithas, only material which the Tosefta added to the Mishnah, kind of extrapolated the Tosefta from the Mishnah. There was the Gemara, the commentary on the Mishnah, and the Talmud, which was the Mishnah and the Gemara. So the rabbinic works included massive materials that were intended to interpret the basic materials included in the Hebrew canon. And then there were sectarian literature like the Dead Sea Scrolls that I mentioned earlier, found in Qumran. And the Dead Sea Scrolls included all the Old Testament books except Esther, the pseudepigrapha, like the books of Jubilee, Enoch, and the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, commentaries like the Midrash, and community works, which were works that were specifically applicable to the Dead Sea community, the Essenes. They had their own manual of discipline. They had a war scroll. They had Thanksgiving hymns, etc. So as we conclude, I want you to think about that verse in Galatians 4:4 where Paul said, in the fullness of time, God sent his son. I want you to just think about all that means, especially from the intertestamental period of time. I want you to think about how God used the progression of events. First, the contributions of the Greek Empire. Because of the Greek Empire, as oppressive as it was, there was a movement toward a one world view, and there was a breakdown of the city-state system. And there was the use of the Greek language throughout the Greek Empire. And there was a contagious Greek quest for knowledge and truth. And there was the challenge of Greek philosophy. All of that helped to prepare for the coming of Jesus. But it was not just the contributions of the Greeks, it was also the contributions of the Roman world. The Roman Empire made the Mediterranean world, in fact, one world. This is when the mantra developed, all roads lead to Rome. The structure of Roman law created some stability. And the atmosphere of Roman tolerance of religion, as long as it did not foster rebellion against Rome, enabled the Jewish religion to survive and even flourish, giving birth to the Christian faith. And then, of course, there was the contribution from the Jews themselves, the God of the covenant people, the Old Testament, and all of the ways the Hebrew canon pointed to the Christian gospel, specifically the prophecies regarding the coming of the Messiah. And then, of course, the synagogues became worship and learning centers that enabled the gospel to spread. And the Jewish world is the world that produced the personnel that would lead the Christian movement. The Christian movement grew out of the Jewish faith. So at just the right time, Paul said, in the fullness of time, after the Greeks had made their contributions and the Romans had made theirs and the Jews had made theirs, at just the right time in God's redemptive plan, God sent his son. Well, that's where we will pick up when we open the New Testament and begin surveying the New Testament. Now, for those of you who are following us in real time in the fall of 2020, you may want to take a break until January, when we will pick up the study of the four Gospels. So if you are following us in real time, you'll have an opportunity to celebrate Christmas, the birth of Jesus, and then in January, we will begin immediately talking about the birth and life and death and resurrection, the ministry and teachings of Jesus. So I hope you've made it this far, and I hope you'll keep going with us as we begin to survey the New Testament in the next session. In the meantime, I do hope that you will contact me. Let me hear from you. I'd love to get your feedback and your questions and comments. And at least let me know that you're out there, that you're listening. And I hope that you will be able to join us for the survey of the New Testament that we will begin the first Sunday after Christmas.